A soul stands before a door no living hand can open. Behind it waits the Duat, not heaven, not hell, something older, stranger, and far more dangerous. For the ancient Egyptians, death was not the final scene. It was the first step into a hidden country, a place of gates, guardians, trials, spells, gods, and terrible silence. The dead did not simply vanish. They traveled. They had to know where to walk, what to say, which names to speak, and what truths could not be hidden. One mistake could mean more than death. It could mean being erased. But to understand that journey, we have to slow down. We have to leave behind the modern idea that the grave is an ending, a sealed conclusion beneath the earth. In Egypt, the tomb was closer to a threshold, a prepared doorway, a place where the body remained behind while the soul began moving into a realm shaped by danger, memory, and divine order. And so we begin at that edge. Imagine the air changing, the heat of the living world fading, the familiar weight of sunlight gone. Ahead, there is no ordinary road, only a passage into a landscape the Egyptians described through ritual texts, funerary images, and sacred imagination. The Duat was not drawn like a map for tourists. It was revealed in fragments, in coffins, tomb walls, papyrus scrolls, and spells meant to protect the dead from forces that had no interest in human comfort. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe, so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. Because this is not just a story about death. It is a story about what a civilization believed must survive death. The body, the name, the heart, the memory, and the fragile hope that beyond fear there might still be renewal. Chapter 2. The Jackal in the Shadows. Before the dead could face judgment, before the heart could be weighed, before the soul could hope to enter any field of peace, there was a figure waiting at the edge of the body. Anubis. To modern eyes, he is one of the most instantly recognizable gods of Egypt. The black jackal-headed guardian, upright and still, watching over tombs with a calm that can feel almost unnerving. But his image was never only meant to frighten. It carried a tension that ancient Egyptians understood very well. The jackal was an animal of the desert margins, a scavenger seen near burial grounds, a creature connected with the vulnerability of the dead. And yet, in Egyptian imagination, that same form became protection. This is one of the great transformations in Egyptian religion. A threat becomes a guardian. The animal that might disturb the dead becomes the divine power that keeps the dead safe. Anubis stood in the fragile space between decay and preservation. He was linked to embalming, to funerary rites, to the careful treatment of the corpse, and to the sealed places where the living tried to defend memory against time. His black color was not simply the color of night or dread. It also recalled the fertile black soil left by the Nile, a sign of regeneration. Even in his darkness, there was a promise. That detail matters, because it prevents us from reducing Anubis to a monster at the door. He was not waiting to drag the dead into horror. He was, in many ways, the first reassurance that the journey had rules. The dead were not abandoned to chaos. Someone watched. Someone knew the paths. Someone understood the terrible importance of the body lying still behind them. And the body mattered more than we might expect. For the Egyptians, a human being was not just a simple split between flesh and soul. Identity was made of several parts, and the physical body remained deeply connected to the person's continued existence. If the body was neglected, damaged, or forgotten, something essential was at risk. This is why the work of preservation became sacred labor. Embalming was not merely a technical craft. It was a defense against disappearance. Anubis belonged to that defense. Imagine the embalmer's room, not as a place of horror, but of discipline. Oils, linen, resins, ritual gestures, practiced hands. The goal was not to deny death. No Egyptian priest could look at a corpse and pretend death had not arrived. The goal was to make death survivable, to prepare the dead for a passage that would require form, name, memory, and recognition. There is a quiet intelligence in this belief. Ancient Egyptians did not imagine eternity as something vague and effortless. They imagined it as something that had to be prepared for. You did not simply die and drift peacefully into the beyond. You needed protection. You needed words. You needed the help of gods. You needed a body that could still be recognized as yours. Anubis, then, is frightening only if we misunderstand what he is guarding. He is the god who stands where the living can no longer help directly. Family members could mourn. Priests could recite. Artists could paint the walls of the tomb. Craftsmen could prepare coffins and amulets. But once the deceased passed beyond the reach of human hands, the protection had to continue in another form. That is where Anubis waits. Not with warmth, exactly. He is not a soft god. His presence is too still for that, too closely tied to the tomb and the treatment of the dead. But there is comfort in his severity. He belongs to a world where death is not ignored, softened, or hidden away. He looks directly at what decay threatens to do, and he answers it with preservation. The jackal in the shadows is not there to celebrate death. He is there to make sure death does not take everything. Chapter 3. The body that had to survive. The dead person's journey did not begin in some distant, invisible kingdom. It began with the body. That may feel strange to a modern mind. We often talk about the soul as if it floats free from the physical world, cleanly separated from flesh the moment life ends. But ancient Egyptian belief did not make that separation so simple. The body was not an empty shell to be discarded. It was a point of return, a recognizable form, a kind of anchor for identity. So the corpse had to survive. This is why mummification mattered so deeply. It was not only about grief, status, or the desire to keep the dead looking lifelike, although those things could certainly matter. At its heart, mummification was a religious technology, a careful attempt to hold back decay long enough for eternity to remain possible. The body was washed, treated, dried, wrapped, and protected. Organs were removed or preserved according to developing practices. Linen transformed the vulnerable corpse into something ritually guarded. Amulets could be placed among the wrappings. Prayers and gestures turned physical preparation into sacred preparation. The process was practical and symbolic at once, which is exactly what makes it so revealing. Egyptian religion often worked in this double way. A thing could be real in the hands and sacred in meaning. Linen was linen, but it could also be protection. Resin was resin, but it could also be a barrier against corruption. A coffin was a crafted object, but it could also become a new container for rebirth. The tomb itself should be understood in the same way. It was not merely a grave. A grave receives the dead. A tomb, in the Egyptian imagination, helped equip them. Inside, the deceased might be surrounded by food offerings, images, personal goods, funerary texts, and objects meant to sustain existence beyond the visible world. The exact richness of the tomb depended heavily on wealth, period, region, and status, so we should be careful not to imagine every Egyptian buried like a pharaoh. Most people could not command the resources of kings, but the underlying hope was remarkably persistent. The dead needed care, and the living had a role in providing it. There is something very human in that. A tomb says, "This person still matters." It says, "Their name should not vanish." It says, "We cannot follow them into the Duat, but we can prepare the threshold." That preparation was not sentimental decoration. It was meant to be effective. Images could serve a purpose. Words could work. Offerings could nourish. The boundary between representation and reality was not the hard wall many modern people assume it to be. In the sacred context of a tomb, a painted loaf of bread was not just a picture of food. It participated in the larger ritual attempt to keep the dead supplied and remembered. This is where Egyptian afterlife belief becomes both beautiful and unsettling. It does not let the body disappear from the story. It refuses to pretend that mortality is clean. Death creates practical problems. Bodies decay. Names are forgotten. Families fail. Tombs are robbed. Time eats everything not defended. Mummification was one answer to that problem. Not the only answer, and not an answer equally available to everyone in its most elaborate form, but a powerful one. It treated the body as something worth rescuing from collapse. It made preservation an act of faith. And yet, the preserved body was never the whole destination. No mummy, however carefully prepared, was meant to remain simply as a silent object in wrappings. The body was part of a larger system of survival. The deceased also needed the right words, the right knowledge, the right moral standing, and the favor or protection of divine beings. The tomb, then, becomes a station between worlds. Behind it lies earthly life, family, work, hunger, laughter, illness, age. Ahead lies the Duat, uncertain, guarded, and dangerous. Between them rests the prepared body, wrapped against decay, surrounded by signs of care. It is easy to look at a mummy in a museum and see only strangeness, or to treat it as an artifact from a civilization obsessed with death. But that misses the deeper point. The Egyptians were not obsessed with death in the simple sense. They were intensely concerned with continuity. What must be preserved so that a person remains a person? The body was one answer, not because flesh could defeat death by itself, but because without it, the journey ahead became more precarious. To survive in the next world, the dead needed to remain whole in more than one way. They needed form. They needed memory. They needed recognition. And so, before the soul approached the gates, before the gods asked their questions, before the heart came trembling to the scale, there was this first act of resistance. A body prepared not for burial alone, but for eternity. Chapter 4. The Map Written in Spells. A map does not always look like a drawing. Sometimes it looks like a sentence. Sometimes it looks like a name, carefully spoken at the correct moment. Sometimes it looks like a spell written in black ink on papyrus, rolled beside a body that can no longer speak for itself. What we now call the Book of the Dead was not a single book in the modern sense. It was not an official scripture with one fixed order, one author, and one universal edition. It was a collection of funerary spells, gathered, copied, arranged, adapted, and personalized across time. Different people could be buried with different selections. Some scrolls were beautifully illustrated. Some were more modest. Some were made for individuals wealthy enough to purchase elaborate preparations for the next world. The modern title can be misleading. Book of the Dead sounds grim, almost like a forbidden manual discovered in a locked chamber. The ancient Egyptian title is often translated more closely as Coming Forth by Day, which changes the feeling entirely. It suggests emergence, movement, a hope that the dead might step out from darkness into renewed life. That difference matters, because these spells were not written simply to describe the afterlife. They were meant to help someone survive it. A description is passive. A spell is active. The words were tools. They could identify dangers, answer guardians, protect the body, defend the heart, and give the deceased the correct voice in places where ignorance could be fatal. The dead were imagined as travelers, but not helpless travelers. They could be equipped. They could be taught. They could carry language with them like a kind of protection. There is something almost bureaucratic about parts of this underworld, though it is a sacred bureaucracy rather than an earthly one. There are gates, names, declarations, examinations, correct phrases, divine officials who must be recognized. The soul does not simply wander through a dream. It moves through a realm where order must be understood and respected. To us, this may seem strange, but think of how much human life depends on knowing the right words. A password opens a locked account. A legal phrase changes a person's status. A name on a document can grant access, inheritance, protection, or belonging. The Egyptians extended that intuition beyond death. In the Duat, language did not merely communicate reality. It helped shape the deceased person's ability to move within it. Still, we should be careful. These texts do not give us a clean, simple travel guide to the underworld. They come from religious tradition, priestly practice, artistic convention, and centuries of change. They do not always fit together like chapters in a novel. Some spells overlap. Some reflect older beliefs. Some emphasize protection. Others transformation. Others judgment. What survives is not one neat system, but a rich and sometimes uneven record of what Egyptians hoped, feared, and prepared for. That unevenness is part of the truth. Ancient belief was not frozen. It breathed across generations. As funerary traditions developed, ideas once strongly associated with kings could appear in broader contexts. Texts migrated from pyramid walls to coffins to papyrus scrolls. The dead carried more than objects into the tomb. They carried inherited words, and those words reveal a civilization that took the dangers of the unseen very seriously. The Book of the Dead does not imagine death as a soft mist into which everyone gently dissolves. It imagines obstacles, enemies, confusion, the possibility of losing one's way. But it also insists that preparation matters. The dead person is not defenseless. The living can help. Knowledge can help. Ritual can help. A carefully written spell can become, in the imagination of the tomb, a lamp held against annihilation. This is why the text feels less like a book to be read from beginning to end, and more like a survival kit. One spell might protect against a hostile force. Another might allow the deceased to breathe. Another might prevent the heart from betraying its owner during judgment. Another might help the soul pass through a gate whose keeper demands recognition. Each one answers a different anxiety. Not abstract anxiety, but very specific fear. What if I cannot speak? What if I am stopped? What if my own heart speaks against me? What if I am forgotten? What if I never come forth into light again? The Egyptians did not solve those fears by pretending they were small. They wrote them down. They wrapped them into ritual. They placed them beside the dead. And in that act, we can sense the tenderness behind the complexity. The spells were not just magic in the theatrical sense. They were a form of care, a family, a priest, a scribe, an artist, an entire religious tradition, all working to give the deceased one more chance to pass safely through a world no living person could fully describe. The map was written in spells because the path itself was not made of earth. It was made of danger, memory, divine law, and words powerful enough, Egyptians hoped, to carry a human being through the dark. Chapter 5. Into the Duat. The Duat was not simply a place where the dead lay still. It was a realm they had to cross. That is the first thing to understand, because it changes the entire mood of Egyptian afterlife belief. Death was not imagined as a single doorway opening into a finished eternity. It was movement, passage, a hidden geography where the deceased could be transformed, protected, threatened, and tested. The Duat is difficult to describe because the Egyptians themselves described it through layered images rather than one clean explanation. It could be dark. It could contain rivers, caverns, gates, divine beings, hostile forces, and regions through which the sun god traveled during the night. It was not the underworld in the simple modern sense of a place below the ground, although burial naturally pulled the imagination downward. It was also cosmic. It belonged to the rhythm of night and dawn, disappearance and return. That rhythm mattered. Every evening the sun seemed to die into the west. Every morning it rose again. To the Egyptian religious imagination, this was not just a beautiful natural pattern. It was a sacred drama of renewal. The sun's nightly journey through the hidden realm offered a powerful model for what the dead hoped to achieve. To enter darkness was terrifying, but darkness was not automatically defeat. If the correct passage could be made, if the forces of chaos could be overcome, darkness might become the place where rebirth was prepared. This is where the Duat becomes more than a landscape. It becomes a test of order. The dead were not passing through empty gloom. They were entering a world dense with presence. Gods watched. Guardians challenged. Dangers waited at thresholds. Names had to be known. Words had to be spoken. The journey could feel almost architectural, as though existence itself had been divided into chambers of permission and refusal. And yet, we should not flatten this into a fantasy adventure. The Egyptian underworld was not designed to entertain. It was a serious religious answer to a serious human problem. How can a person survive the collapse of ordinary life? The answer was not, by doing nothing, and the answer was, by being prepared. Prepared in the body, prepared in the tomb, prepared in speech, prepared in moral truth, prepared through ritual contact with divine order. The Duat gathered all those preparations and put them under pressure. A soul entering it was not merely escaping the world of the living. It was being measured against a reality older and larger than human preference. The living world had sunlight, family, food, work, argument, injury, repair. The Duat stripped that familiarity away. In its place came a realm where every boundary seemed to ask, "Do you know who you are? And do you know what order requires?" There is a deep psychological honesty in that idea. Many cultures imagine death as a crossing, but the Egyptian version is unusually concrete. The dead do not dissolve immediately into peace. They face confusion first. They face questions. They face powers they cannot overpower by strength. In that sense, the Duat is not only a religious location, it is an image of vulnerability. You are beyond the help of ordinary tools. You cannot buy your way past every danger, though wealth might have provided better tombs, finer texts, and more elaborate rites. You cannot command the gods as if they were servants. You cannot pretend your life left no trace. The journey forces exposure, and still, the Duat is not pure hostility. That is the part often missed. It is dangerous because it is sacred, not because it is meaningless. There are rules. There are guides. There are spells. There are divine beings whose authority can protect as well as threaten. The dead are not traveling through chaos itself, but through a realm where chaos presses against order from every side. This made the journey frightening, but not hopeless. The Egyptians imagined danger in detail because they also imagined protection in detail. They did not draw a vague darkness and leave the dead inside it. They named the dangers. They placed guardians at gates. They created words for passing through. They pictured the gods who would receive, judge, record, and defend. In a strange way, the complexity of the Duat is a form of mercy. A nameless terror cannot be answered. A named danger might be faced. So the soul moves deeper, away from the tomb, yet still connected to it. Away from the body, yet still dependent on its preservation. Away from the living voice, yet surrounded by words chosen before burial. The journey is slow because transformation is slow. The dead must pass through spaces that are not meant for the careless. The Duat is the hidden country, where identity is tested, where memory must hold, where sacred knowledge becomes a shield, and where the promise of renewal remains possible only because the path is so carefully guarded. This is not rest, not yet. It is the long passage through the dark machinery of the cosmos, where death begins to reveal what it has taken, and what, if the soul is prepared, it may be forced to give back. Chapter 6. Names, Gates, and Hidden Knowledge. In the Duat, a closed gate was not only a barrier, it was a question. Who are you? What do you know? By what right do you pass? Again and again, Egyptian funerary tradition returns to this idea. The afterlife was full of thresholds, and thresholds had guardians. These were not decorative monsters placed along the road to make the journey more dramatic. They represented a deeper religious logic. The next world was ordered. Access mattered. The dead had to prove they were not intruders in sacred space, and proof often came through knowledge. A name could open what force could not. A spell could protect where strength was useless. A correct answer could turn danger aside. The deceased was imagined as someone who needed to recognize divine beings, identify gates, speak to guardians, and use sacred language at the proper moment. This is one reason the funerary texts feel so strange and powerful. They are full of precise verbal tools for situations no living person could verify, but every mourner feared might be real. To modern ears, this may sound like superstition wrapped in passwords, but that reaction says more about us than about Egypt. We live in a world where hidden knowledge still controls access. Codes, signatures, legal identities, sacred formulas, passwords, official names, all of these decide who may enter, who may claim, who may be recognized. The Egyptians imagined the cosmic version of that same reality. In the Duat, knowing a name did not mean casually labeling a thing. It meant grasping something of its power, its nature, and its place in the divine order. A name was not just information. A name was relationship. That is why namelessness was frightening. To lose the name was to lose the thread that tied a person to memory, family, ritual, and continued existence. Tomb inscriptions preserved names because remembrance itself helped sustain the dead. Spells preserved names because the journey required recognition on both sides. The dead had to know the powers they faced, and the powers had to know the dead as someone prepared, protected, and properly presented. The gates of the Duat sharpen this idea into ritual drama. Imagine the soul approaching one of these guarded places. There is no army behind them, no earthly title that automatically solves everything. Even a person of status must rely on the forms of sacred preparation. The guardian is not impressed by panic. The gate does not open because the traveler wishes it would. The dead must speak what has been given to them. This makes the afterlife feel strangely intellectual. Survival depends not only on purity or protection, but on memory. The dead must carry knowledge across the break of death. The words copied on papyrus, painted on coffins, or spoken in ritual become extensions of the mind. They help the deceased remain articulate in a realm where silence could become dangerous. But there is a tension here. If knowledge protects, then who has access to that knowledge? Not everyone in ancient Egypt could afford elaborate funerary texts, decorated tombs, or professional ritual services. The hope of safe passage may have widened over time, but it was never detached from social reality. Wealth could buy better preparation. Status could shape burial. Literacy and priestly expertise mattered. Eternity, at least in its most carefully equipped form, was not equally distributed. That is an uncomfortable truth, and it makes the beauty of these beliefs more complicated. The spells suggest a universe governed by order, but the earthly ability to obtain them depended on human inequality. A finely written scroll could promise safe passage through divine gates, yet the person who owned it might have reached that scroll through privilege. This does not make the belief false to those who held it. It makes it human. Religious hope often travels through the materials a society can provide, and those materials are rarely shared evenly. Still, the idea itself reached beyond wealth. At its core, this system expressed a profound fear of being lost in the unknown, and an equally profound trust that knowledge could resist loss. To know the gate was to make the unknown less absolute. To know the guardian was to turn terror into encounter. To know the spell was to keep the self from dissolving under pressure. This is why the underworld journey was not only a passage through darkness. It was a passage through meaning. Each threshold asked whether the dead belonged to the ordered cosmos or whether they would fall into confusion. Each correct name was a small act of alignment with Ma'at, the principle of truth, balance, and right order that held the world together. Chaos, in this imagination, was not just violence, it was misrecognition. Speech failing, names lost, boundaries broken, the wrong person entering the wrong place without the right preparation. The Duat guarded against that. So the dead continued forward, carrying words like keys. Not metal keys. Not keys you could hold up to the light and admire. Keys made of memory, ritual, and sacred sound. And somewhere ahead, beyond the gates and the guardians, the journey was moving toward a more severe kind of test. Because knowledge could carry the dead through many dangers, but it could not erase the life they had lived. Eventually, the traveler would stand before powers who did not ask only what they knew. They would ask what they had been. Chapter 7. The Gods Who Watched the Passage. The underworld was dark, but it was not lawless. That distinction matters. When people imagine an ancient underworld, they often picture a place where order has collapsed, a realm of wandering spirits, monsters, punishment, and fear. But the Egyptian Duat was not simply a pit of terror. It was watched, governed, structured by divine presence. Its dangers were real, yet they existed inside a cosmic system where names, roles, judgments, and boundaries mattered. The dead were not alone. Anubis had already appeared at the edge of the body and the tomb, a guardian of embalming and safe passage. But he was not the only power involved. The journey of the dead moved through a crowded sacred landscape, where each god revealed a different aspect of what Egyptians believed survival required. Osiris stood at the center of the hope for rebirth. He was the dead king who became Lord of the Dead, the divine figure whose own restoration gave meaning to the idea that death could be crossed without becoming complete destruction. His presence made the afterlife feel less like escape and more like entrance into a kingdom. Ma'at was not only a goddess, but a principle. Truth, balance, justice, rightness, the order by which the cosmos remained livable. Without Ma'at, the world did not merely become unpleasant. It fell toward chaos. In the afterlife, Ma'at was not an abstract virtue placed politely in the background. She was the measure by which existence itself could be tested. Thoth, the ibis-headed god, associated with writing, wisdom, and record-keeping, brought another kind of authority. In judgment scenes, he is often shown recording the result, calm and exact. That image is easy to overlook, but it is quietly unsettling. The heart may tremble, the deceased may hope, the gods may watch. And Thoth writes, the cosmos remembers accurately. There were also guardians, assessors, gatekeepers, and divine figures whose names and functions could vary across texts and periods. Some are obscure to us now. Some appear fierce. Some seem almost administrative. But together they show that the Duat was not imagined as empty darkness. It was a realm thick with divine attention. This attention could comfort or terrify, depending on where one stood. If the deceased had been properly prepared, if the correct words were known, if the heart could meet the standard of truth, then divine order was not the enemy. It was protection. It meant the journey was not random. It meant terror had limits. It meant the dead might appeal to powers who cared about balance rather than appetite. But if a person approached the afterlife unprepared, dishonest, or outside the order required by the gods, the same structure became dangerous. The rules did not bend simply because someone was afraid. The underworld was not cruel in the way a human tyrant might be cruel. It was severe because it was sacred. That severity is one of the most interesting features of Egyptian afterlife belief. The gods were not gathered merely to console the dead. They were there to maintain the order of reality. The afterlife was not a private dream tailored to each person's wishes. It was part of the same cosmic fabric that governed sunrise, kingship, fertility, truth, and the continuing battle against chaos. In that sense, death did not remove someone from the moral universe. It placed them more deeply inside it. During life, a person could hide many things. A false word could pass unnoticed. A selfish act could be buried under reputation. A powerful person could appear righteous because others were too afraid to say otherwise. But the Egyptian underworld imagines a place where appearances are stripped of their usual protections. The gods do not need gossip. They do not need public approval. They do not need a monument praising the deceased in polished phrases. They have the heart. They have the scale. They have the record. This does not mean Egyptian religion should be simplified into a modern courtroom drama. The evidence is more complex than that, and different funerary traditions emphasize different dangers and hopes. But the judgment scene reveals something essential. The Egyptians linked eternal survival to order, and order included moral truth. That idea gives the Duat its strange dignity. It is frightening, yes. There are gates that do not open easily. There are beings whose names must be known. There are threats no living person would wish to face. But the darkness is not meaningless. It is supervised by gods whose roles give shape to fear. Anubis protects and guides. Osiris receives and reigns. Ma'at measures truth. Thoth records. Other guardians enforce the boundaries. The dead pass through a world where every power seems to ask a different version of the same question. Are you aligned with order, or have you belonged to chaos? This is why the Egyptian underworld still feels so compelling. It does not imagine death as a simple reward or punishment delivered instantly. It imagines a process, ritual, intellectual, moral, cosmic. A person must be preserved, equipped, guided, questioned, and finally measured. The gods who watched the passage did not make the journey easy. They made it possible. And ahead, among those divine powers, one figure waited with a stillness deeper than Anubis, older than any single tomb scene, and heavier than fear. Osiris, the silent king below. Chapter 8. Osiris, the silent king below. Anubis guides the dead, but Osiris receives them. That shift is important because it changes the underworld from a road into a kingdom. Anubis belongs to the threshold, the tomb, the embalming chamber, the dangerous first movement away from the living world. Osiris belongs to the destination, or at least to the great center of meaning beneath the journey. He is not merely another guardian along the way. He is the ruler whose own story gave the Egyptian dead a pattern to hope for. Osiris was a god marked by death. In the broad shape of the myth, he is killed, mourned, restored, and transformed. The details could vary across Egyptian tradition, and later versions tell the story with fuller drama. But the core image is powerful enough on its own. A divine king passes through death and does not simply disappear. He becomes lord of the realm below. His restoration does not return him to ordinary life exactly as before. It changes him into something more mysterious, a sovereign of the dead, a sign that destruction might be answered by renewal. That is why Osiris mattered so deeply. He did not offer the dead a cheerful denial of mortality. He offered something more serious, a sacred precedent. If Osiris could be restored after death, then perhaps the human dead could also be restored in their own way. Not as gods equal to him, not as people pretending death never happened, but as beings who might be made whole enough to continue. There is a quiet, emotional realism here. The Egyptian hope for the afterlife was not built around the idea that death was harmless. Osiris himself proves the opposite. Death wounds the divine order. It breaks the body. It causes mourning. It creates absence. But the myth also insists that death is not the only force at work. There is lamentation, ritual, reassembly, protection, kingship, and rebirth. In other words, the answer to death is not forgetfulness. It is restoration. Osiris became dominant in Egyptian afterlife belief because he made that restoration imaginable. A dead person could be associated with him. Funerary language often linked the deceased to Osiris, placing them under the shadow of his story and within the hope of his renewal. To be an Osiris was not a casual metaphor. It meant the dead person was being drawn into a sacred pattern: death, preservation, judgment, and possible rebirth. This is where the Egyptian underworld becomes more than a survival course full of dangers. It becomes a place with a king, a still king, a silent king. Osiris does not feel restless like the traveler. He waits. He presides. He is often shown enthroned, wrapped like a mummy, holding symbols of authority. His body bears the stillness of death, but his position radiates rule. That image is strange and brilliant. A living king rules by command, movement, force, appearance, ceremony. Osiris rules from stillness. His authority comes not from avoiding death, but from having passed through it and become inseparable from what lies beyond. The dead approach him because he understands the condition they have entered. He is not a distant sunlit god looking down at mortality from a safe height. He is the god below, the king who knows the grave from inside the myth. This may be one reason his cult and imagery held such power. Osiris made the underworld personal without making it soft. The dead were not being sent into a faceless void. They were entering a realm governed by a figure who embodied both death and renewal. His presence gave structure to hope, but hope under Osiris was not automatic. That is another detail modern retellings can miss. The existence of a merciful or restorative god did not erase the need for judgment. Osiris did not turn the afterlife into an unconditional welcome. His court was still connected to Ma'at, to truth, to the weighing of the heart. Renewal had to be compatible with order. The dead could not simply claim eternity by desire alone. This balance is essential. Egyptian afterlife belief was neither simple optimism nor simple fear. It held both together. The dead might be restored, but only if they could pass through the sacred structures that made restoration meaningful. A corrupt eternity would not be renewal. It would be chaos wearing a mask. So Osiris sits below as the image of what the dead seek, but also as a reminder of what they must become: whole, recognized, aligned with order, able to stand before the divine court without being destroyed by the truth of their own life. Anubis protects the body and guides the passage. Thoth records, Ma'at measures. But Osiris gives the journey its deepest promise, that death may be transformed into a different kind of existence, one rooted in fertility, continuity, and divine order. His myth turns the underworld from a place of mere darkness into a place where renewal can be judged possible. And now the path narrows. The traveler has moved through danger, names, gates, and guarded knowledge. They have entered a realm watched by gods and ruled by a dead king restored to power. But no one reaches Osiris by atmosphere alone. No one passes into blessed renewal simply because the tomb was beautiful or the spells were carefully copied. The heart still has to answer, and somewhere in the sacred court, beneath the gaze of gods who do not need to guess, the Hall of Two Truths waits. Chapter 9. The Hall of Two Truths. At last, the journey becomes quiet in a different way. Not the quiet of a tomb, not the quiet of desert darkness, the quiet of being seen. The Hall of Two Truths was the place where the dead faced the meaning of their own life before the gods. After all the gates, names, spells, and protections, the traveler reached a threshold that could not be crossed by cleverness alone. The underworld had many dangers, but this one was the most intimate. The danger was not a serpent, a locked gate, or a guardian with a hidden name. The danger was truth. In Egyptian belief, judgment was not simply a divine opinion. It was connected to Ma'at, the principle of order, balance, justice, and rightness that sustained the cosmos. To live well was not merely to avoid punishment. It was to live in a way that did not tear against the structure of reality. A human life mattered because it either supported order or fed the forces that threatened it. That is a severe idea, but not a crude one. The Hall of Two Truths was not imagined as a place where the gods needed to discover information. The gods were not detectives collecting clues from confused witnesses. They did not require rumors, accusations, or a neighbor's testimony. The judgment scene goes deeper than public reputation. It suggests that every life carries a record within itself. The deceased had arrived with preparation: a preserved body, funerary spells, ritual protection, perhaps a name carefully written where the living could remember it. These things mattered. They were not dismissed. But now another question rose above them all. What did the person's life weigh? This is why the emotional force of the scene has lasted for thousands of years. Even if one does not share the theology behind it, the image is difficult to escape. A person stands before powers they cannot bribe, flatter, or outrun. The polished version of the self falls away. Titles become thin. Wealth becomes quiet. The tomb's beauty cannot speak louder than the heart. There is an unsettling fairness in that. The Hall of Two Truths asks the question people often spend their lives avoiding. What remains when no one is performing anymore? Ancient Egyptian funerary texts include declarations of innocence, sometimes called negative confessions, in which the deceased denies having committed various wrongs. We should not read these as a simple modern autobiography. They are ritual statements, shaped by religious tradition, meant to place the deceased in alignment with Ma'at. But their existence tells us something important. The afterlife was not only about surviving monsters, it was about moral order. The dead had to speak as someone who belonged in a balanced universe. Of course, we have to be cautious. These texts do not give us a complete picture of everyday Egyptian ethics across all classes and centuries. They are funerary compositions, often connected to those who could afford them. The polished words of a tomb do not necessarily reveal the private reality of a life. A rich person could be buried with beautiful declarations. A poorer person might leave far fewer traces. As always, the evidence is shaped by survival, status, and material access. But the ideal still matters. It shows that the Egyptians imagined death as a moment when social illusion could no longer fully protect the self. In life, hierarchy could distort justice. In death, at least in sacred imagination, the person stood before something larger than hierarchy. Ma'at was not supposed to be impressed by power. The scale did not care how loudly a person had been praised. This is where the hall becomes more than a mythic chamber. It becomes a moral dream. A dream that truth exists. A dream that a life can be measured against something beyond convenience. A dream that the universe is not indifferent to balance. That dream is not gentle. It can be frightening, because it means nothing is entirely lost. Words spoken in secret, harm done quietly, obligations ignored, truth bent for advantage. These things may not remain hidden forever. The heart remembers what reputation edits out. And still, the hall is not merely a place of accusation. It is also a place where vindication becomes possible. The deceased who passes judgment is declared justified. Their life, or at least their ritual and moral presentation of it, is found compatible with order. They are not swallowed by chaos. They are recognized. Recognition is the deeper reward before any field of abundance. To be judged true is to be allowed to continue. The Hall of Two Truths gathers everything the journey has been preparing for. The body had to survive so the person could remain whole. The spells had to guide so the person could arrive. The names had to be known so the gates could open. The gods had to watch so the process would have authority. Osiris had to reign so the dead could hope for restoration. But now the traveler stands where hope meets examination. The silence here is not empty. It is full of witnesses. Anubis is near the balance. Thoth is ready to record. Osiris presides. Ma'at is present not only as a goddess, but as the standard by which the soul must be understood. The entire underworld seems to pause around a single fragile object, the human heart. And soon that heart will be placed on the scale. Chapter 10. The Heart on the Scale. The heart was not only an organ, it was the witness. In ancient Egyptian thought, the heart carried something close to the center of the person: memory, intention, conscience, identity. It was the place where a life gathered itself. The brain, which modern people tend to treat as the seat of selfhood, did not hold the same religious significance in this context. The heart was the inner record. It knew what had been done, what had been desired, what had been hidden, and what could no longer be edited. So when the heart was placed on the scale, the dead were not being judged by an object outside themselves. They were being judged with themselves. Across from it was the feather of Ma'at, light, delicate, almost impossibly simple. But the feather represented one of the heaviest ideas in Egyptian religion: truth, justice, balance, right order. Ma'at was the structure that kept the sun moving, the Nile meaningful, kingship legitimate, speech trustworthy, and society from sliding into chaos. To be measured against Ma'at was to be measured against the pattern that made existence possible. This is what gives the weighing scene its force. The scale does not ask whether the deceased was admired. It does not ask whether they were powerful. It does not ask whether their tomb was expensive. It asks whether the heart can stand in balance with truth. Anubis is often shown attending the scale, carefully performing or supervising the weighing. This is not the Anubis of cheap horror imagery. He is precise, controlled, almost ceremonial. His role suggests that judgment is not a frenzy, it is a procedure. Even the most frightening moment in the afterlife must be conducted according to order. Nearby, Thoth records the result. That detail can feel almost colder than the scale itself. A judgment spoken aloud might fade. A judgment written down becomes part of the divine record. Thoth's presence tells us that the cosmos is not merely watching, it is accounting. And then there is the heart. One of the most striking fears preserved in funerary tradition is that the heart might speak against its owner. That fear is psychologically sharp. People can control what they say in public. They can rehearse innocence. They can arrange flattering images around their memory. But what if the deepest part of the self refuses to cooperate? What if, at the moment when everything depends on being found true, the heart tells the truth too well? This is why spells could ask the heart not to betray the deceased in judgment. To a modern reader, that may sound like trying to cheat the court. But the matter is more complicated. These spells belong to a ritual world where speech, identity, and protection were intertwined. The goal was not necessarily to erase guilt as a modern fraud might. It was to keep the heart aligned with the deceased's hope for justified existence, to prevent hostile forces or uncontrolled testimony from destroying the possibility of rebirth. Still, the tension remains. If Ma'at is truth, and the heart must not speak against the dead, what exactly is being protected? That question opens a window into the complexity of Egyptian belief. The afterlife was not a simple moral machine where one input produced one output. It was ritual, cosmic, social, and ethical at once. A person needed moral standing, but also proper burial. They needed truth, but also spells. They needed divine order, but also human preparation. The judgment scene holds all of these together without fully resolving the discomfort. And perhaps that is why it feels so human. Most people want justice, but they also want mercy. They want truth, but fear exposure. They want to believe the universe has order, but hope that order will not crush them. The heart on the scale expresses all of this in one unforgettable image. A small human life is placed opposite cosmic truth, and for a moment, everything depends on balance. There is no need to exaggerate the scene. Its power is already severe enough. The feather does not roar. The scale does not burn. The gods do not need theatrical anger. The terror lies in stillness, in measurement, in the possibility that the truth of a life has weight. If the heart balanced with the feather, the deceased could be declared justified. They could continue toward the renewed existence they had sought through preservation, ritual, and divine protection. Their identity had survived examination. Their life had not fallen outside the order of the cosmos. But if the heart failed, the result was not simply a sentence in the way later traditions might imagine punishment. Something waited beside the balance. Not a judge, not a jailer, a devourer. And for the Egyptians, what came next may have been more frightening than endless suffering. It was the possibility that the person would not continue at all. Chapter 11. The Devourer waiting beside the balance. Beside the scale waited Ammit. Not at the center of the judgment, but close enough to make the meaning of the judgment impossible to ignore. She was the Devourer, a composite creature often described through parts of the most feared animals of Egypt's world: crocodile, lion, and hippopotamus. This was not random decoration. These were creatures associated with force, danger, and the violent edges of the natural order. In Ammit, those fears were gathered into a single presence, crouched near the balance, waiting for the heart that failed. But Ammit was not exactly a devil. That distinction is important. Modern viewers often try to fit her into later ideas of hell, demons, and eternal torment. But the Egyptian fear here was different. Ammit did not rule an underworld prison. She did not tempt the living. She did not offer a rival kingdom to the gods. She waited as part of the judgment system itself. Her terror came from what she represented: the end of the person's hope for continued existence, the second death. To die once was to leave the living world. To die a second time was to be cut off from renewal. That possibility may be one of the most chilling ideas in Egyptian afterlife belief. Failure did not necessarily mean suffering forever in a fiery realm. It meant annihilation, erasure from the ordered cosmos. No blessed fields, no restored existence, no honored place among the justified dead. The person who had crossed the Duat, carried spells, approached the divine court, and stood before the scale could still lose everything. Not pain without end, meaning without continuation. That is a quieter terror, but perhaps a deeper one, because the Egyptian afterlife was built around preservation. Preserve the body, preserve the name, preserve memory, preserve the heart's alignment with Ma'at, preserve the possibility that the dead could live again in a transformed state. Ammit is frightening, because she is the answer to failed preservation. She is what waits when identity can no longer be carried forward. Her presence beside the scale also tells us something about Egyptian justice. Judgment was not symbolic theater with no consequences. The moral order of the cosmos had teeth, literally, in the imagery. If a life fell too far from Ma'at, it could not simply be absorbed into eternity as if truth did not matter. Chaos could not be granted the same future as order. That sounds harsh, and it is. But within Egyptian religious logic, it also protected the world. Eternal life was not imagined as a private reward detached from cosmic balance. To continue beyond death, the deceased had to be compatible with Ma'at. Otherwise, renewal itself would become corrupted. A universe that preserved everything, including what opposed its order, would not be merciful. It would be unstable. This is where Ammit becomes more than a monster. She is boundary. She marks the limit of hope. The Devourer's role forces the afterlife journey to remain serious. Spells matter. Burial matters. Divine guidance matters. But none of these reduce judgment to a harmless ritual. The soul has crossed a dangerous realm not because the Egyptians enjoyed imagining danger, but because they believed eternity required separation, the justified from the unjust, order from disorder, continuation from collapse. Still, we should be careful not to make the scene too neat. We cannot step into the mind of every ancient Egyptian and know exactly how each person imagined Ammit, or how fearfully they held this belief in daily life. Religious images work at many levels. They teach, warn, comfort, frighten, and dramatize truths that ordinary language cannot hold for long. Ammit may have been feared as a literal devourer, understood as a ritual symbol of annihilation, or both at once depending on context and person. What we can say with more confidence is that her presence gave shape to a fear older than any single religion. The fear that after all our effort to be remembered, nothing of us will remain. No name spoken, no face recognized, no return, no dawn. That is why Ammit's silence feels so heavy. She does not need to accuse. The heart has already done that, if it fails. She does not need to judge. The scale has already spoken. She is the consequence waiting after measurement, the final refusal of a universe that cannot allow disorder to pass disguised as truth. And yet, her presence also sharpens the hope on the other side. Without the possibility of failure, justification would mean less. If every soul arrived safely regardless of its life, the weighing would become ceremony without weight. Ammit makes the balance matter. She makes Ma'at more than an ideal painted on a wall. She makes the passage through the Duat a moral crossing, not simply a magical escape route. So the dead stand before the scale, and everything becomes unbearably precise. The feather waits, the heart answers, Thoth records, Anubis watches, Osiris presides. And beside them all, Ammit crouches at the edge of eternity, not as chaos breaking into the court, but as the final guardian against chaos entering the world beyond. For the justified, she is the terror they pass. For the condemned, she is the end of the road. And beyond that terror, for those whose hearts remain in balance, another landscape begins to open. Not a hall, not a gate, not a trial, but a field washed clean of fear. Chapter 12. The field beyond fear. After the scale, the story changes its breathing. The journey through the Duat has been narrow, guarded, and severe. Gates had to open. Names had to be remembered. The body had to be preserved. The heart had to stand beside the feather of Ma'at, without collapsing under the truth of its own weight. Ammit waited close enough to make failure final. But for the justified dead, the path did not end in terror. It opened into peace. Egyptian afterlife hope could be imagined in several ways, and we should be careful not to turn every tradition into one simple picture. But one of the most enduring images is a fertile realm of abundance, often described as a perfected continuation of the best parts of earthly life. Fields, water, crops, food, stability. The dead were not always pictured as escaping the world completely. They were often imagined as receiving the world renewed, cleansed of its fragility, disorder, and hunger. That is a revealing kind of paradise. It is not made of clouds. It is not an abstract glow. It is land that gives. For a civilization shaped by the Nile, fertility was not a decorative detail. It was survival. The annual rhythms of water and soil, determined whether communities could eat, whether families could endure, whether order could hold. So it makes sense that blessed existence beyond death might be imagined through agricultural abundance. A good field was not modest imagery. It was security made visible. The reward was not only rest, but continuity. The justified dead hoped to live on in a world where the conditions of life were made reliable. Work could still appear in these visions, but in an idealized form, protected from the desperation that haunted earthly labor. Food was available. The land was fruitful. The person continued under divine order rather than under the constant threat of decay, famine, and disappearance. This is where the darkness of the earlier journey begins to make sense. The Duat was not dangerous because the Egyptians believed the universe was cruel for no reason. It was dangerous because renewal had to be protected. The field beyond fear could not simply be opened to chaos. It had to belong to those who had been preserved, guided, judged, and found true. In that way, paradise was not separate from judgment. It depended on it. The field was peaceful because the scale had already done its work. The calm on the far side was not cheap. It had passed through danger and moral examination. The deceased had not avoided the question of truth. They had survived it. There is something profoundly grounded about this hope. Many modern people imagine eternity as release from physical need, from place, from labor, from the old human attachment to food, family, land, and name. Egyptian afterlife belief often moves differently. It suggests that what people wanted was not to become vague and bodiless, but to remain recognizably themselves in a restored order. To eat without fear, to be remembered without interruption, to dwell where life continues, to rise in some form after having gone down into darkness. That hope reflects a civilization that did not see material life as spiritually meaningless. The body mattered, the tomb mattered, bread mattered, water mattered, names mattered, fields mattered. Eternity was not imagined as a rejection of creation, but as its repair. And yet, even this peaceful vision carries a trace of unease. If the afterlife is pictured as fertile land, then it still depends on maintenance, ritual, and divine favor. The dead needed offerings. They needed remembrance. They needed words and images that kept the channels open between the worlds. Eternal life was not simply a private possession locked safely away. It remained relational. The living helped the dead. The dead remained connected to the living. The gods upheld the order that allowed both to continue. This is why the tomb was never just behind the story. It remained tied to the field ahead. A grave in Egypt could be a place of return, offering, name-speaking, and ritual care. The journey through the Duat may sound distant and cosmic, but it was anchored in family memory and physical places. Eternity began with people who still cared enough to prepare the dead properly. The field beyond fear, then, is not merely a reward scene placed after the dramatic judgment. It reveals what the entire journey was for. Not escape, restoration. The dead sought a life beyond decay, but not beyond identity. They wanted to remain whole, recognized, nourished, and aligned with Ma'at. They wanted the dangerous passage to end not in emptiness, but in a world where order had finally become stable. When the justified dead entered that imagined abundance, the terror of Ammit did not disappear from the story. It remained as the shadow that made the field luminous. The soul had come close to erasure and had not been erased. It had entered the dark geography of the gods and emerged into a place where life could begin again. That is the power of the Egyptian afterlife vision. It does not offer peace by ignoring fear. It offers peace after fear has been faced, named, measured, and passed through. Chapter 13, A Journey Not Only for Kings. At first, eternity in Egypt wore a crown. The oldest surviving royal funerary texts speak from a world where the king's afterlife was imagined on a scale no ordinary person could claim. The pyramid itself was not just a monument of power. It was a machine of royal transformation, a structure built to lift the dead king into a continuing cosmic role. In those early visions, the king's death was not a private family tragedy. It was a matter of universal order. But Egyptian religion did not remain sealed inside royal stone forever. Over time, hopes that had once been expressed most fully for kings began to appear in wider forms. Funerary traditions developed. Coffin texts, tomb scenes, and eventually papyrus spell collections helped extend afterlife preparation beyond the royal household. The journey through the next world became imaginable for more people than the divine king alone. This is sometimes described as a democratization of the afterlife. It is a useful phrase, but it needs caution. Democratization can make the process sound cleaner and kinder than it was. Eternity did not suddenly become equal. Access still depended heavily on wealth, rank, family resources, literacy, scribal labor, priestly services, and the ability to secure a proper burial. A beautifully prepared tomb was not available to everyone. A finely copied funerary scroll cost something. Ritual knowledge moved through institutions and specialists, not through a perfectly open public library. So the change was real but uneven. The doors opened wider, not all the way. That unevenness tells us something essential about ancient Egypt. The hope for survival after death was not only a matter of theology, it was also material. You needed people to wash and prepare the body. You needed linen, resins, objects, images, perhaps texts. You needed a place of burial safe enough to preserve what had been prepared. You needed the living to remember your name. In theory, the next world was governed by ma'at, not money. In practice, money helped you arrive equipped. That contradiction is not a minor footnote. It is one of the most human features of the entire story. Societies often imagine ultimate justice beyond earthly inequality, yet the rituals meant to reach that justice are performed through earthly resources. The Egyptian dead entered the Duat with hopes shaped by cosmic order, but their preparation began in a world of craftsmen, priests, families, and budgets. Still, the widening of afterlife hope mattered. It meant that more individuals could imagine themselves as participants in a sacred drama once reserved most visibly for kings. A non-royal person could be associated with Osiris. Their heart could be weighed. Their name could be preserved. Their tomb could become a point of contact between earthly memory and eternal aspiration. That shift changes the emotional scale of the Egyptian underworld. It is no longer only the story of a divine ruler passing into the sky or reigning among gods. It becomes the story of scribes, officials, artisans, women of status, families with enough means, and eventually many more who sought some share in the promise of continuation. The afterlife became more personal, more intimate, more crowded with ordinary human fear. Not ordinary in the sense of simple, ordinary in the sense of recognizable. A person dies, a family worries, a body must be prepared, a name must be written, a path must be opened through the unknown. The royal afterlife had been monumental. The broader afterlife was, in many ways, more tender. It carried the same cosmic seriousness into smaller human spaces. A coffin, a scroll, a painted offering scene, a carved name. And yet, the social limits never vanish. We should not romanticize the process as if every Egyptian enjoyed equal ritual protection. Many lives left little trace. Many burials were modest. Many hopes are lost to us because the people who held them could not afford materials that survived. The archaeological record itself is biased toward those who could build, write, preserve, and be preserved. That means the history of the Egyptian afterlife is also a history of silence, not the sacred silence of the Duat, the archival silence of poverty. For every decorated tomb that speaks in color and formula, there were countless dead whose beliefs must be inferred more cautiously. They may have shared the same hopes in simpler forms. They may have relied on family memory, local custom, or less elaborate rites. But the evidence does not let us give them all the same voice. This should make us humble. The grandeur of Egyptian funerary religion can easily overwhelm us. Gold masks, painted papyri, carved chambers, divine courts. These things draw the eye. But beneath them is a broader human desire, not to vanish, to be carried forward somehow, to have one's body treated with care, one's name spoken, one's life weighed fairly, one's future not stolen by decay. That desire was not royal. It never has been. Kings built pyramids, elites bought scrolls, families prepared tombs within their means. But the fear beneath the ritual was shared by anyone who understood that death threatens not only breath, but memory. The journey through the Duat became, over time, a path more people could imagine walking. Not equally, not without cost, not free from hierarchy, but more widely than before. And that quiet widening may be one of the most important transformations in Egyptian religious history. Eternity slowly moving out from the palace, passing through workshops and scribal hands, entering coffins, papyri, and family tombs, until the hope of renewal was no longer only the privilege of a king beneath a pyramid. It had become a question many could ask: will I, too, be remembered enough to live? Chapter 14. What the dead were really seeking. By now, the Egyptian underworld may seem crowded with strange machinery. A preserved body, a tomb stocked with objects, a scroll of spells, gates with guardians, divine names, a jackal-headed guide, a silent king, a feather, a scale, a devourer waiting beside it. But if we look only at the strangeness, we miss the human center of the story. The dead were not simply seeking a place to go. They were seeking a way not to come undone. That is the deeper meaning of the journey. Death threatened the body, yes, but also the name, the memory, the social bonds, the moral self, and the person's place inside an ordered universe. Egyptian funerary belief answered that threat piece by piece. Mummification protected the form. Tomb inscriptions protected the name. Offerings protected nourishment. Spells protected speech and movement. Judgment protected the moral order. Osiris offered the hope that restoration could follow destruction. Every part of the system answered a different fear. What if my body decays? What if no one remembers me? What if I cannot speak when speech matters most? What if I lose my way? What if my life is weighed and found false? What if death does not merely end me, but removes me from meaning? These are ancient questions, but they do not feel ancient in the distant sense. They feel familiar. Strip away the papyrus, the linen, the divine imagery, and the same anxieties remain. Human beings still worry about whether they will be remembered honestly. We still build monuments, write names, preserve photographs, tell family stories, record voices, save messages, and return to graves. We still fear not only dying, but becoming unreachable. The Egyptians gave those fears a sacred architecture. That architecture was not random. It was built around order. Ma'at appears again and again because Egyptian afterlife belief was not only about personal survival. It was about surviving correctly, in harmony with the truth that held the cosmos together. The dead did not seek eternity as a private escape hatch. They sought a restored place within a balanced universe. This is a subtle but important difference. A selfish immortality would have been spiritually dangerous. To live forever while opposing Ma'at would not be triumph. It would be a continuation of disorder. The Egyptian hope was not simply, "May I continue." It was closer to, "May I be made fit to continue." That gives the entire underworld journey a moral seriousness that is easy to overlook beneath the visual drama. Ammit is frightening. The gates are mysterious. Anubis is unforgettable. But the central question is not theatrical. It is ethical. Can a human life become aligned with truth? And if not perfectly, then at least sufficiently to be restored? The evidence cannot tell us how every Egyptian felt when they imagined this. Belief is never identical from person to person, and the texts that survived are shaped by wealth, literacy, priestly tradition, and the accidents of preservation. Some people may have feared the underworld intensely. Others may have found comfort in its order. Many probably held both feelings at once, as people often do when facing death. What we can say is that the Egyptian afterlife was not an empty fantasy pasted over mortality. It was a sustained attempt to think through the problem of human continuation. What remains when breath stops? What must be protected? What must be judged? What can the living do for the dead? What can the gods do that humans cannot? Those questions gave the tomb its seriousness. A tomb was not just a room filled with things. It was a statement of resistance against disappearance. It said that the person had not been reduced to nothing. It said there was still a name to speak, a body to protect, a path to imagine, and a relationship between the living and the dead that had not been completely severed. That relationship is one of the most moving parts of the Egyptian vision. The dead needed the living, and the living needed the dead to remain within order. Offerings, prayers, inscriptions, and remembrance were not only gestures of affection, they were acts of maintenance. The boundary between worlds was not sealed in indifference. It had to be tended. This is why the journey through the Duat feels so carefully constructed. It is not chaos dressed in mythology. It is a map of anxieties and answers. The Egyptians looked at death and refused to let it remain vague. They gave it doors, names, gods, scales, dangers, and possible outcomes. They made the invisible world thinkable, not safe, thinkable. And perhaps that is what the dead were really seeking, not simply comfort, but intelligibility. A universe where death did not make nonsense of life. A universe where memory mattered, justice mattered, preparation mattered, and the self could be carried through darkness without dissolving into it. The underworld journey is frightening because it admits how much can be lost. It is beautiful because it insists that not everything must be. For all its unfamiliar images, this belief system was built around a hope we can still recognize. That a person is more than a moment of breath. That truth outlasts performance. That care given by the living can cross farther than the eye can see. And that somewhere beyond fear, there may be a form of renewal we cannot fully describe from this side of the door. Chapter 15. The Last Light in the Halls of Anubis. At the end of the journey, the darkness found no longer feels empty. It has a shape now. There is the tomb behind us, prepared with anxious care. There are the spells carried like memory through a country no living traveler could map with certainty. There are the gates, the names, the watching gods, the silent throne of Osiris, the feather of Ma'at, the heart on the scale, and the Devourer waiting for what cannot be made true. And there is Anubis, still near the edge, still watchful. It is tempting to remember him only as the Jackal in the shadows, the god whose face belongs to a creature seen near burial grounds, where the desert met the fragile places of the dead. But by now, that image has changed. Anubis is not the monster of the Egyptian underworld. He is one of its first acts of mercy. A severe mercy, yes, a mercy without softness, but mercy all the same. Because he stands where human hands begin to fail. The living can wash the body, wrap it, mourn it, bury it, speak the name, and place offerings before the tomb. But they cannot walk every step beyond the threshold. They cannot answer every guardian. They cannot steady the heart when it faces the feather. They cannot force the dead into renewal. So the Egyptians imagined help waiting there, not help that removed danger, help that made passage possible. That may be the most honest thing about their underworld. It did not pretend death was easy. It did not reduce grief to a comforting sentence. It admitted that the way ahead was frightening, that identity could be lost, that truth mattered, that preparation might fail, and that eternity was not something to be taken lightly. Yet it also refused despair. The Duat was terrifying, but it was not meaningless. Its halls were guarded because order mattered. Its judgments were severe because truth mattered. Its spells were preserved because words mattered. Its tombs were built because bodies and names mattered. Even Ammit, terrible beside the balance, belonged to a universe where chaos was not allowed to pass unchallenged. This is why the Egyptian vision still holds us. Not because we believe every detail as they did, not because we can reconstruct every ritual feeling with perfect confidence, but because the structure of the hope remains recognizable. We too want death to lead somewhere other than erasure. We too want memory to survive the body. We too want justice to be more than public performance. We too want the people we have lost to remain held in some order larger than grief. The ancient Egyptians answered those desires with linen, resin, papyrus, stone, prayer, image, and myth. They built a road through the dark and placed guardians along it. They imagined a court where the heart could be known completely, and a field where the justified might live again in peace. And at the edge of that road stands Anubis, calm in the darkness, not smiling, not threatening, waiting. He is the reminder that the Egyptian underworld was never only a place of terror. It was a carefully imagined passage from danger toward renewal, from decay toward preservation, from silence toward a name still spoken. Its darkness was real, but it was not the final truth. Somewhere beyond the guarded doors, beyond the scale and the devourer, the dead hoped for morning. And perhaps that is the last secret of the Halls of Anubis. The path through death was frightening because life was precious, and the journey mattered because something, somehow, might still be saved.